Welcome to my channel, where I learn pastry and chocolate techniques and share my journey along the way. Today I'm making a chocolate and coffee entremet inspired by the book Entremet by French chefs Christophe Felder and Camille Lesecq. It is not perfect, yes, there are things I would change, but I wanted to share it anyway as I continue learning more about entremet. It features a coffee-soaked Joconde sponge, a crunchy hazelnut coffee layer, dark chocolate mousse, and a dark chocolate ganache, finished with cocoa powder and coffee beans. My goal isn't just to show a recipe, but to help understand the why behind the how. With this in mind, I take time to explain concepts more deeply, even things you may already know, and I hope you'll enjoy the lesson. We start by preparing the crunchy layer. This layer has no water. The fatty part includes milk chocolate, praline paste, and butter. The dry part includes wafer crumbs and ground coffee. First, melt the milk chocolate and the butter separately because they melt at different temperatures. I melt the chocolate in the microwave using 10–15 second intervals and stirring each time in between. I avoid a water bath because steam can cause the chocolate to seize. Once melted, combine the butter and chocolate with a spatula. The cocoa butter in the chocolate makes the filling firm, while the nut oil in the praline paste softens it, which gives an easier bite. Add the praline paste and mix until smooth and fully combined. In this recipe, I'm using a hazelnut praline paste with 60% of nuts. You can replace it with another nut praline paste to change the flavor. In a separate bowl, mix the dry ingredients together so they are evenly distributed. Wafer crumbs can be replaced with puffed rice or chunks of biscuit. The fatty part and the dry part are ready. Gently fold the dry ingredients into the chocolate mixture, being careful not to crush the wafer crumbs. Make sure all the dry elements are well coated with the fats. This helps them stay crunchy in the dessert. If the chocolate starts to set at this stage, you can put the bowl briefly in a microwave and stir. We will use the same frame that we will use to assemble the entremet. Spread the mixture evenly in the frame using a palette knife and set aside a small amount for decoration. Freeze until solid, then wrap in cling film until assembly to protect it from moisture and odors. You can leave out the butter and prepare this filling in larger quantities. Store it in an airtight container at room temperature not exceeding 22 degrees, and when you need a crunchy layer, melt the required amount in the microwave and use it. For the cake, we need eggs, ground almonds, icing sugar, egg whites, sugar, butter, and all-purpose flour. First, I combine these three ingredients. Make sure to sift your icing sugar to avoid lumps. I mix everything with a whisk until I obtain a smooth, homogeneous mixture. If you add the icing sugar directly on top of the eggs instead of the almond powder, make sure to start mixing immediately. Sugar absorbs moisture from the egg yolks, which can create lumps that won't dissolve later. In pastry, we call this burning the eggs. This mixture is heavy because of the almond powder, which makes it harder to whip. Since warm eggs trap air more easily, I gently heat the mixture over a bain-marie to just below the coagulation point at around 55 degrees. Make sure the bowl doesn't touch the hot water directly and that the water is only gently simmering. I stir continuously so the heat is evenly distributed and to avoid any local coagulation. Once the mixture reaches 55 degrees, I start whipping at high speed. The key here is to fully whip the eggs before the mixture cools down completely. Be aware that the mixture tends to cool down quite abruptly when it's transferred from the bain-marie to the bowl of a stand mixer. If this happens, you can help maintain the temperature by gently warming the bowl with a heat gun while whipping. This is a fairly long process and it takes about 10 minutes to fully whip the almond egg mixture. How do you know when the eggs are fully whipped? If you lift the whisk, the mixture will fall back and leave a visible mark on the surface for several seconds before slowly disappearing. In pastry, we call this stage the ribbon stage. For now, you can set it aside. Now I will prepare the meringue, which is the most important element in the structure of a Joconde cake. Make sure the bowl and the whisk are completely grease-free and that there is no trace of egg yolk in the egg whites. Even small amounts of fat will prevent proper whipping. Here I'm using fresh egg whites at room temperature taken directly from shell eggs. In this case, to whip the whites, we first need to break the gel-like structure of the protein called albumin, so the proteins can begin trapping air bubbles. I start mixing at medium speed to break down the protein structure. This stage is called denaturation, meaning the proteins lose their natural, tightly structured state. We never whip egg whites at high speed because this creates large air bubbles. A meringue made this way will not be stable when we start folding it with other ingredients and will collapse. Medium speed ensures the formation of many small air bubbles, which creates a much more stable structure for folding later on. As mixing continues, you will start to see air bubbles forming along the sides of the bowl. We keep mixing at medium speed until the mixture becomes very airy with no liquid remaining at the bottom of the bowl. At this stage, you can see that the egg whites have incorporated many small air bubbles, but there are still no peaks. The foam is still fragile, which is why we now need to add the sugar to stabilize the meringue. It is important to add the sugar gradually in small portions so the weight of the sugar doesn't destroy the air bubbles. The mixer speed remains the same, medium speed, while adding the sugar. It's also important not to overwhip the egg whites before adding the sugar. If too much air is incorporated, the protein network becomes overstretched and eventually collapses, releasing water and air bubbles. If this happens, don't add the sugar. It is better to restart the meringue. As the sugar dissolves in the water contained in the egg whites, it forms a sugar syrup that stabilizes the structure of the meringue. And in this sense, sugar acts as a structural element, helping to hold the air bubbles in place and preventing the meringue from collapsing when we fold it later on. We allow each addition of sugar to dissolve completely before adding the next one. After adding the last portion of sugar, I let the mixer continue whipping while closely observing the texture. For meringues that will be folded later, we are not looking for a stiff meringue, but for one that is stable and still soft. How do we know when the meringue is ready? One of the most obvious signs is that it becomes shiny and the whisk starts to leave visible marks on the surface as the egg whites are being whipped. If the meringue becomes grainy and watery, this means the egg whites are over-whipped. In that case, don't use it in a cake. The meringue we are looking for is stable, meaning the mass in the bowl doesn't move if you gently flip it over. At the same time, it should remain soft. You can see this by lifting the whisk. The meringue forms a peak and the tip gently bends instead of standing straight. There is a logic to the order. We whip the almond egg mixture first because it can sit without collapsing, while the meringue is more fragile. Just before the meringue is ready, I melt the butter to 50 to 60 degrees so it won't solidify when added. To combine three textures without losing air, we first mix the butter with a small portion of both airy mixtures to bring everything to a similar consistency. At this stage, I stir without worrying about preserving the air bubbles. This is the sacrifice that allows the final folding to be gentle and efficient. Make sure to mix thoroughly at this step so there are no streaks or pockets of melted butter left in this mixture before folding everything together. Some chefs first fold the meringue into the egg mixture and add the flour afterward. I prefer to fold everything together in one step since all the three components now have a very similar consistency. Where you add each component doesn't really matter, choose what is most convenient for you. And here I add the butter mixture to the almond egg mixture, then place all of the meringue on top. I sift half of the flour evenly over the bowl and begin folding with a silicone spatula. Folding should be done with a minimum number of movements. The motion goes from the center down to the bottom of the bowl, then along the sides and back up to the top. I rotate the bowl as I repeat this movement. I sift the second portion of the flour even though the mixture isn't yet fully combined, in order to preserve as much air as possible. Remember, the more we mix, the more air we lose. In production, when working with large batches of cake batter, this step is often done by two people. One person holds pre-sifted flour in folded baking paper and adds the flour continuously, while the second person folds the butter at the same time. Make sure there are no traces of dry flour left in the batter, and once the butter is homogeneous, stop mixing, it's ready to use. Notice that the final texture has returned to the ribbon stage, which means we did not lose air during mixing. Without waiting any longer, we bake the cake in an oven preheated to 210 degrees with the fan on. Joconde cakes are never baked in cake rings. They are baked flat as they are intended for roulade cakes, where flexibility is important, or for entremet. This recipe yields 2 trays of Joconde cake. The cake is baked at a very high temperature for 5 to 6 minutes. This allows us to preserve maximum moisture while rapidly coagulating the proteins in the batter, which gives the cake its structure. Be careful when spreading the butter on the tray. If you move it too much from left to right or up and down, you can lose air, which will affect the lightness and texture of the cake. How do you know the Joconde cake is ready? It should have a uniform golden brown color and spring back when gently pressed. When the tray comes out of the oven, the cake continues to cook from the residual heat, which can make it lose moisture. To prevent this, transfer the cake onto a cooling rack and let it cool to room temperature. Storing the cake in the freezer before assembly makes the process easier. If you don't plan to assemble it the same day, you can keep it tightly wrapped in the freezer for up to a month. Since my freezer is quite small, I need to remove the silicone mat, and to do this, I place another silicone mat or a sheet of baking paper on top, flip the cake over, and gently peel the mat away. As you remove the silicone mat, you can immediately see if your Joconde cake was successful. If you lost too many air bubbles during mixing or baking, you won't see the tiny pores like in this video. Instead, the cake will appear shiny and dense. Having these small pores is essential for this cake because we will soak it with coffee syrup during assembly. If the surface is smooth and shiny like an ice rink, the syrup won't absorb properly. Wrap the cake tightly in cling film to prevent it from drying out in the freezer.